Welcome to Tripping Over Love, where we talk all about breakdowns, breakups, and breakthroughs. I'm Courtney Corona with Keith Miller.
So exciting to talk to Ben Malcolm.
Yeah, no, it was a really good conversation.
Yeah, so Ben is a psychiatric pharmacist, and he's somebody, he calls himself the Spirit Pharmacist, and he's somebody that I've gotten in touch with for personal therapeutic psychedelic exploration.
Educational reasons. Yes.
Your doctor, your primary care doctor is not going to tell you whether you should or shouldn't do MDMA and what dose might be appropriate for you based on the medicines and conditions you have.
Well, and to his point, he's not providing medical advice specifically per person, but it's more education. So
internet information.
Yeah. So all of this was certainly education, nothing else beyond that. But it is really fascinating. And as, you know, he was talking about the psychedelic renaissance and everything along those lines. And as interest continues to grow, the importance of education is so critical to making sure you have a safe experience, an experience that fits like within your needs and all of those things. So he's doing a really important service for a lot of people, and lives in Costa Rica, and
I want to visit him.
Just seems to be living a really cool life.
And he plays the Didgeridoo. Like,
did you know what the Didgeridoo was before?
Oh yeah.
Oh, you say that as if.
Oh yeah. Like, I know the Didgeridoo. No, it's such a cool sound. He talked a little bit about this, but you got to look at his Instagram videos of him playing it.
Which is Spirit Pharmacist.
Spirit Pharmacist Instagram.
And it's this long, I won't get into how it's made because he talks about this, but it's this very long tube-looking thing. He said it's the oldest
woodwind instrument in the world, like tens of thousands of years in use by Aboriginal people in Australia. So here's Ben Malcolm.
Enjoy.
Hey, Ben, welcome to Tripping Over Love. How are you today?
I'm doing really well. It's really nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, nice to meet you. I got to tell you, when I turned on my computer to start our session this afternoon, you know how Microsoft has screensavers that they'll pop up different things randomly, different images? Mm-hmm. And it was a kangaroo. And I was just reading that Ben was born in Tasmania, right? So you have Australian roots. Is that right?
Absolutely. I was born in Hobart, and I lived there until I was around 10 and a half, almost 11 years old. So yeah, Tasmania it's an island state. So it is part of Australia, but it's south of the mainland.
Yeah, cool. And you play the didgeridoo. We got to talk about that at some point.
We did.
Today.
We were going through your Instagram yesterday, and we're fascinated by the videos.
Yeah. Well, do you want to chat about it now, or do you want to save that for a little bit later? Or?
What got you? It's fun. So yes, we'll get into your background and all of it. But what got you into that? It's an unexpected instrument to be playing.
Yeah. Well, there's a bit of history there. So first of all, the didgeridoo, or didgeridoo, right? A lot of persons haven't necessarily even heard of the instrument. But it is an Australian Aboriginal instrument, and it is just historically ancient overall. We're talking tens of thousands of years, and a lot of persons really think that it might be like the original type of woodwind instrument, or really the first one that was ever out there overall. And the didgeridoos that the Australian Aboriginals play, they essentially go through the outback or the bush, and they will tap different tree trunks and find the ones that have been hollowed by termites, right? And then they'll use some levels of tools to kind of finish hollowing them out. And then they paint them in their traditional styles with Aboriginal dot art. And so I would have to say that being born in Australia and living there really gave me a level of awareness about what the didgeridoo is, how it sounds, and things like that probably really is an important part of the origin story. But like I just mentioned, I moved to the United States when I was 10 and a half, almost 11 years old. And I didn't really start playing didgeridoo until I was 18 years old. And so there was some other interval history there. Like, for example, I played brass in middle school. I played baritone, trombone, and tuba. And it turns out that the embouchure and the size of the mouthpiece of a didgeridoo is very close. It's somewhere between a trombone and a tuba on average. And so I was at a flea market in Arizona when I was 15, and they had didgeridoos there. And I just found that I could make the basic drone sound just from my history playing brass in middle school. And then, I don't know, I got nominated into this. It was like almost like a male beauty pageant. It was like a fundraiser. It was like the Mr. North Eugene High School kind of thing. It was like as a senior in high school. And part of the final show was that you had to do something on stage. And the only things I was good at was chemistry, biology, and swimming. And none of that was really lending itself to a stage right? talent, right? And so there was just a piece of me that was like, I know they have didgeridoos down at Pacific Woodwinds. I know that I can make a basic droning sound in it, and I'm going to go out and buy a didgeridoo and learn how to play it for this talent show type of thing. And so I did, and I learned the circular breathing for that. And I wouldn't say that I was like great at it at that point. And I played, I would say, like very small amounts during undergraduate. It was almost like a wall ornament, and I would take it down and give it a toot when everyone was, well, what is that kind of thing? But as soon as I was done with undergraduate, I was just in some gap years, and all of a sudden it was kind of like, I don't swim competitively anymore. I don't have to study full time. What the heck am I going to do? And so I started playing didgeridoo for 30 to 60 minutes a day, and I did that for about 5 days a week for a couple of years, and I became quite good at the instrument during that period of time. And it really sort of became part of, I think, my spiritual journey.
That's really cool.
Yeah, that's what's so fascinating. I think just generally, right, how the universe works. And because that obviously wasn't planned, but then the way it works so well with the work that you're doing and the degrees that you have and all of that is incredible. So can you talk a little bit more about your journey? And so you're doing that, but then you obviously got into pharmacology, you got into psychedelics. How did that all manifest in your life?
Yeah, like how many psychiatric pharmacists play the didgeridoo is what I'm wondering. Probably not many.
I don't know how many. Like, honestly, I've not met another one that plays the didgeridoo yet. I don't want to say that they aren't out there.
You could be the one, Ben.
I might be. I mean, but really, like going back to the question, I was almost interested in I was interested in psychoactive drugs as a teenager. I became interested through watching documentaries about addiction when I was 13 to 15 years old, which led me to start reading about particularly addictive drugs online and finding anecdote repository sites like erowid.org. And through reading particularly about illicit substances, because a lot of illicit substances do have addictive natures or tendencies to them, I came across things like psilocybin and MDMA and just noticed that the trajectory of the users and the types of experiences that they were reporting was so much different than anything else that was really out there or regulated as an illicit substance. And so I had a strong intellectual curiosity that led to an experiential curiosity by the time I was around 17 or 18 years old. And so I would say that for me, psychedelics were really there at the beginning of the day. And they really almost inspired this educational pathway through a bachelor's in pharmacology, through wanting to pursue a doctorate of pharmacy degree. And it wasn't because I was like, I know I love psychedelics and I really get into a position where I have this sort of background in education and training so I can become a pharmacist that specializes in those types of things. I really didn't have the sort of intentional foresight that that's where it was going to go. And the world just wasn't even interested really in psychedelics at that point. That was before the psychedelic renaissance really, I think, heated up and took off overall. So I think it was hard to have that kind of foresight. But I knew that I had a passion for reading about psychoactives. I knew that I liked studying pharmacology, and that educational degree path was really something that would allow me to take those interests and have some level of professional background in it. So it was probably likely to land me in the ballpark of something that I actually did want to do or did like, or at least it was just a way of studying something that I was truly, truly interested in. And I got, I think, very lucky in a lot of ways that by about the time 2015 or 2016 rolled around, where I was really graduated, taking a a psychiatric pharmacy residency, the world had become interested in psychedelics. The psychedelic renaissance was occurring. It was kind of like, you know what, there's a position here for somebody to take if they really want to take it. And something just kind of clicked that you're really the same person that you were when you began this journey, except for you're not just like a kid that thinks drug regulation is backwards and has an interest in psychoactives. You're a person that has a bachelor's in pharmacology, a doctorate of pharmacy, a master's in public health, and 2 years of residency training. And so there's a whole lot more for you to stand on in the world, and you're just in a much better position to be a trustworthy but earned trustworthy sort of voice for that, and to be a true advocate of objective science of risks and balances as far as what these things really offer.
And just to pick up on that, Ben, so I think the reason that I found out about you was Courtney and I were thinking about doing an ayahuasca journey. And as anyone knows who's heard about that, it's usually offered in indigenous places, South America, Costa Rica. I think you live in Costa Rica now?
I do.
Yeah. So curious about the overlap there. But so we were thinking about doing it. I know there are places in the States, there's a huge underground emerging and surging kind of underground community of sitters, trip sitters. Some of them are licensed professionals. I don't know any licensed medical professionals personally that are willing to really give advice. So I'm curious about how you do it, and like, is it because you live in Costa Rica that's sort of in the clear, or, you know, are there people in the States that are giving medical advice outside of the academic, legally sanctioned academic psychedelic uses?
Yeah, so truly, technically, right, if you go to the website and sort of read about like, hey, what does this consultation service that I offer really provide, right? It is a risk-benefit evaluation and discussion about the substances that you're interested in based upon the medications, supplements that you're taking, as well as the conditions that you have, rather than a medical green light, clearance, suggestion, or recommendation that you engage with psychedelic substances. And I think that plus or minus could depend a little bit on what we're talking about. Like, do you recommend that I seek ketamine through a medically available and legal channel based on my medications and conditions? There's probably a level of safety in being able to, you know, say yes if the person's appropriate for that, right? Or would you recommend, based on my background and the medications I'm taking, that I could be a good person to apply for a clinical trial and go through a research-related channel, right? Like, yeah, like you have refractory PTSD and you're on one or no medications, and demographically you're, you know, not outside the people that they've recruited, and so you probably really are a person that would be of high interest to applying to that. So there could be situations, I guess, where it's like there is some level of suggestion that they're appropriate for it. But for the most part, like I would say, the tongue-in-cheek way of doing this or explaining what the consultation is that I'm an internet information provider. And it's never illegal to deal information to persons that empower them to make their own decisions, as long as you're not making up bogus information and basing it off of things that just aren't grounded in science or grounded in information or grounded in some level of maybe tradition or anthropologic research, right? Or drawing on your own personal experiences. Like, I would never want to run my drug information service just purely based on like my own experiences and things like that. But they do allow me to have a depth of knowledge about what some of the substances are, what they can do at different dosages and settings and things like that, that is helpful as far as providing education or counseling on persons. And so I'm a drug information dealer that tries to bridge the gap between your psychiatrist or mental health provider and then shaman, clinical psychotherapist that's specialized in psychedelic therapy, right? That is maybe working in an Oregon psilocybin service center or in a jurisdiction like South America, where, you know, ayahuasca may not be, you know, illegal overall. You know, what should I do? What should I do? Like, that's like the golden question that everyone has. Like, well, like what should I do? And it's like, well, you know, Keith, Courtney, like I can't tell you what you should do, but I can tell you what I would do if I had your medications and conditions and
Right.
my background and knowledge and experience, right? Or I can tell you what I would feel comfortable with my loved one, my older mother or father attempting or doing, right? If they're just sort of in a different walk of life, and telling them what I do may not feel so relatable, right? And so
Right.
there's unfortunately a little bit of like couch language and, okay, should I discontinue my antidepressant to drink ayahuasca? I can't tell you if you should discontinue your antidepressant, but according to the guidelines for the management of antidepressants, they recommend persons don't take antidepressants within at least 2 weeks of monoamine oxidase inhibitors, which ayahuasca contains, because of risks of serotonin syndrome. Okay,
Right.
like what do you want to do? Continue it up until the day of, or stop it 2
Right.
weeks ahead of time?
Yeah. And it is such an important service to provide, right? Because people hear about these medicines and there's a lot of hype, there's a lot of positivity around them, emerging research, but then accessibility is very limited unless you're accessing it through a clinical trial. So people are experimenting themselves, right? So how serious of an issue is it for people who are interested in doing this to just kind of figure it out themselves?
I think depending on who you are and what your kind of nature and background is, and kind of like where you live, and I don't know, some persons have experimented with other things in the past, and, you know, crossing some kind of line that's out there when they're convinced that it's positive for their health is not going to be a very hard thing for them to do. And other persons live in persons and places where the fear is a whole lot more real. They have been a person that traditionally and historically really functions within lines, and going over lines is extremely difficult for them overall.
Right.
Some persons are, I think, relatively well resourced and have the ability, I think, to kind of do a level of reconnaissance out there as far as finding access to things and options for access to things, like relatively quickly and without a lot of trouble. And some persons might just find one person that really is not a good energetic fit, and they're inexperienced and potentially even dangerous in it overall. And they're convinced that that's their only option, and that's what they have to go with because that's the only thing that they could find, right? And so yeah, there are different websites out there at this point that frankly aim to be yellow page directories that will help persons at least discover different persons that have expertise in psychedelic therapy or integration work around psychedelic substances, right? There are legally functioning service centers in the state of Oregon and now, you know, Colorado. There are, you know, cities within the U.S. that have decriminalized them and may have a bit more openness, or different psychedelic societies out there. There are not places to seek substances, but there are places to seek persons that have deep knowledge, interest, and expertise in those types of substances. And, you know, it's probably fair to think that where there's smoke, there's fire, right? In if you want to make an analogy about it, there are places in the world like the Netherlands or Jamaica where, you know, mushrooms or truffles are legally regulated types of substances. I mean, ayahuasca is the national sacrament of Peru, right? So like how, you know, outside the bounds is it going to be when the government has actually put it on a pedestal as far as you know, something that is part of their culture that people have a right to sort of spiritually access. So I think more and more there is an ability to at least find the persons that have expertise in this, and that's probably going to be a relatively hot lead to finding the types of things that you're searching for or learning more about them.
Yeah. So I'm thinking, you know, about listeners or viewers who may not have a lot of background in psychedelics, who are listening to this and may not understand why. Yes, of course, safety and interactions, all of that is so important. But I think also what you're talking to is the experience. And we talk setting, all of the elements that are so important to how your experience impacts you. So can you talk a little bit about that as well? Why holistic education is really important to how you experience psychedelics if you do choose to go down that path?
I mean, I think it's been well known for a pretty long period of time that the environment, like, what is the biggest risk of using something like a classic psychedelic like psilocybin or LSD? Is it toxicity to the liver or the kidneys or the heart? Or no, the classic psychedelics are not known to be directly toxic to any organ system of the body. Full stop. Period. Right. So what is the big risk associated with them? Well, it's what we would call like a behavioral toxicity, or essentially a person acting in ways that they could have some kind of accident or could put themselves in harm's way because they're in a severely intoxicated state where the world isn't making sense the way that they're used to the world making sense overall. And so there's some like for example, I like to sort of think along the lines of like, well, if you're going to be in a state where you're going to have to give up some level of control, and depending on the substance you use and the doses that you engage with, you might actually go to places where you don't know who you are anymore, and you just completely aren't in control, right? And so if you've built a container where it's safe to be out of control and it's safe to be in those places or states, it's going to be a whole lot harder to hurt yourself than if you're doing that in a club or a festival type of environment, or walking down the streets of San Francisco when it's dark late at night and just subjecting yourself to whatever sorts of stimuli or persons or whatever else is in the world at that point, where I'm not thinking clearly. I could react or respond to things in ways that are not so predictable, right? Or not so straightforward like normally, right? So probably safeguarding persons against behavioral intoxications, right, would be one really strong reason to consider controlled sets and settings. I think from a more like therapeutic type of angle, we're discovering more and more that psychedelics have neuroplastic effects, meaning they have the ability to rewire or shape or change the way a person experiences the world acutely, and sort of maybe what their emotional predispositions are. Like, it helps a person see the world differently. So to be able to see yourself, your relationship to things, the cosmos, metaphysical structures, to see old things in new lights, it offers a novelty of an experience that really could be transformative and shifting in some ways, right? But, when I think of like plasticity, maybe we could use an analogy and sort of like think about okay, we're in pottery class and we're given a piece of putty. Well, I could put a blindfold on and take a screwdriver and a hammer and just start smashing the putty, right? And hope that I'm going to get some sort of really lovely sculpture at the end of the day. But in that uncontrolled environment where I'm just leaving that piece of neuroplastic putty to the forces that are around it, the chances of it being molded in a way that they weren't looking for and is not beneficial starts to go up. Whereas if I'm, intentionally thinking, okay, I have this piece of putty in front of me, what am I going to do with it? I really want to make a vase, right? I can start using my hands on that piece of putty, and the chances of getting a vase that I can put some flowers in afterwards is going to be a whole lot better than if I don't have that intention and I don't have that skill and like craft around the putty that's in front of me. And so I remember you would come to middle school in America, like 20 years ago, or maybe even more than 20 years ago at this point, it was like, don't take LSD because it can change your mind. And then Michael Pollan wrote this book called How to Change Your Mind. And then everyone wanted to use psychedelics, right? And so I think that the truth is they have the potential to change your mind. But how they change your mind and whether that's going to be a net positive or a net negative for you is really going to be largely dependent on the substances, the doses, your mindset, the intention, the physical environment you surround yourself with, the people and energies that you surround yourself with, the skill sets or lack thereof that those people have. And that's what we're meaning and talking about with this term set and setting being such a critical factor in outcomes around psychedelic use.
As you know, the group Lycos was sort of mixed up with, I guess, or some people have levied the idea against them that they were an advocacy group and doing research as an advocacy group. In other words, they wanted to, there are some people out there that want to promote the research of psychedelics, but are also big fans of it themselves personally. They want and believe other people should do it. And I'm one of those people that, has had the lived experience of having the need from a mental health perspective to open myself up to something other than Zoloft. So as a clinician, I don't hide that story. I tell that story, and I think it helps me connect to some people who, like you said, might be unwilling to color outside the lines and really need to break through and get out of the pattern. What do you think would change in psychiatry, let's just say in the States, if every psychiatrist that was going to prescribe, before they started prescribing, they had to have some sort of encounter, a journey? What would change in the medical world, psychiatry?
It's a really good question. I think it's a really interesting question. And I think that there's almost, there's many ways you can gain experience about something and have some level of knowledge and knowing, right? I think that psychedelics, because of the ways that they affect your consciousness, and I think some of the research that we've done around it using some of the tools that we have. So for example, psilocybin is notorious for being able to elicit what we call mystical types of experiences. And some of the traits of a mystical experience is, a positive mood and maybe euphoria, but it's a type of spiritual euphoria or sacredness where it feels very special and meaningful, meaning that this experience is happening just for me, and there's a specialness to that, right? Non-duality, or feeling like my individuality is merged with a greater life, with a greater consciousness, with a return to source, or like a drop, returning to the ocean. Feeling perfectly still in the moment or in eternity, right? Like essentially feeling outside the bounds of time and space. And then ineffability, or it's impossible to adequately describe this with words. And so from an experiential level or nature, there's a serious value in having some level of knowledge and awareness of maybe what some of the more positive effects can be like. But then I think persons oftentimes go through very challenging sorts of periods where it's dysphoric, where there's nausea, where they can actually feel paranoid or suspicious, even in controlled environments with adequate preparation and good people around you and things like that. And so before we just begin signing up for persons because, hey, the clinical trial said it works, right? Before we begin signing people up for that, maybe it is reasonable to strongly consider some kind of personal experience with the agents. I think that's some of the better arguments for, or pro, right? And then in the same ways, I don't know if using atypical antipsychotics creates an ineffable experience, but you meet a lot of persons maybe that have more serious mental health conditions at baseline, and maybe you can argue their brains are just different than yours at baseline. And you could make that same argument with a clinician that doesn't have refractory PTSD compared to a combat veteran that does have PTSD,
Totally.
a person that has a whole lot of trauma in their background. Is their brain just the same? Does their brain respond the same to psychedelics, right? Is my experience with it good enough to know what their experience is going to be?
Good point.
Right. There's it's not perfect, right? But the same way that it wouldn't be perfect to say my brain responds the same way to atypical antipsychotics as a person that really suffers from schizophrenia does, right? For me, it's very unlikely that an atypical antipsychotic is going to treat any level of paranoia, delusion, psychotic experience, because those aren't the things I'm going to suffer with at baseline. But it is very likely that I'm going to be able to get a sense for just how mood flattening and tranquilizing these agents are. to the extent that when my patients start complaining about that as a side effect, I'm not like, but it treats your psychosis, so just keep taking it because that's what's good for you, like overall, right? And so through various ways, right, through some level of experience, maybe we start to be in positions where we can empathize with people, but then also through just sheer experience, seeing a person take a certain atypical antipsychotic with a profile of being tranquilizing 100 times in a row and listening to them. If you truly listen, you're going to get some good level of experience from that as well that won't require you to take stuff. And I think you could make a similar agent about psychedelic substances. And so I think overall I have to lean towards thinking that psychedelics really do offer something a bit special and different, and that to really be the best, particularly at psychedelic therapy where you're there and there's like a real experiential hands-on piece of it, probably having some level of background experience with them is going to be of benefit to you. And I'm hesitant to say that just sort of like, well, every single psychiatrist needs to use psychedelics before they could possibly suggest recommending a person visit a service center or access a clinic that, you know, does specialize in that type of thing overall. But yeah, I think that in a lot of ways, it would probably be beneficial for many clinicians to be slightly more experiential or hands-on, or have a willingness to sort of put themselves in the shoes of the people that they're trying to help more often in various ways.
Yeah. Just the fairly predictable, like you described, sort of loss of executive function and loss of normal perceptual attitudes.
Well, and the inability to describe what it feels like. When I'm talking to somebody who has had an experience, I can have a much deeper conversation about what happened without saying much, because it's hard to explain what you're feeling if you haven't experienced it.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah,
I think that's true.
Ben, I have a question too. When as you're working in psychiatry and you know, I would imagine a lot of times the idea of the spiritual side mixed with psychiatry and science and all of that, generally, I'd say, at least in the States, doesn't tend to mix as often. So how have you seen that shift as you've worked in this field, and how have perceptions really changed?
I think that there actually are a lot of clinicians out there, or maybe even certain types of advocacy groups and things like that are starting to understand the spiritual component of mental health generally. And for example, like even the American Society of Addiction Medicine, like if I go to their website and they're like, what is addiction? They're saying it's a biopsychosocial spiritual condition or illness, right? So even some of the, I don't know, like more institutional related organizations and societies, like you can find some level of knowledge or awareness within there that a lot of persons are feeling alienated and feeling disconnected, and, you know, maybe not being plugged into some kind of strong spiritual awareness. And I think that there's a lot of ways to do that don't involve, like, you know, fundamental religions and things like that. And actually think that those have a lot of like risks to them as far as creating mental health things through like rigid fear-based belief systems and hierarchical structures. And like it's a mixed bag out there.
Well, I mean, I take what you mean as so far as a spiritual approach is one that is mind expanding, whereas a religious approach might be constrictive or dogmatic. And people can have different opinions about that, but I think that generally that's the difference between spirituality and religion. I think science can be rigid in some ways too and have its own cult or religiousness to it.
That's right. Like I think like spirituality is inherently about like finding a sense of connection, right? Mm-hmm. And I think like a lot of people might be like, well, I'm really spiritual, and so I find this sense of connection between like
Mm-hmm.
lighting sage and smudging rooms and this and that. And then, you got some other person that may not necessarily endorse that they're very like spiritual and may not really dress in like spiritual garb and things like that. But it's kind of like, you know what, when I'm out in the woods in the morning time and my boots are crunching across the leaves and everything is completely still on the lake, there's just this deep sense of peace that I can feel within me. And they probably don't even articulate it quite that well, but they're out there crunching the leaves and walking around that lake in the morning time. They're just not waving a banner that's saying, I'm spiritual,
Yeah.
like overall. And so whatever it is for you, right, you don't necessarily have to come out and like tattoo it on your sleeve, the symbols of how spiritual you are and things like that. But you need to be doing something or finding something that gives you that greater sense of connection and peace and reduces the sort of I don't belong and I'm an alien in here and everything else is meant to be except for myself. Like those are feelings of spiritual alienation, right? And they're symptoms of mental health conditions at the same time. Go figure.
Right, right. And like think of what Joseph Campbell said about we've lost our rituals. We don't have the cultural inclusiveness where people know that they belong. Ben, we talked to John Crystal a couple weeks ago. John Crystal is the Yale researcher that licensed the patent on the molecule for S-ketamine, which is Spravato, as you know. And we asked him about drug development that is happening, and his company, in fact, is working on trying to take the psychedelic effect out of ketamine, which could really improve accessibility, frankly. Some people don't tolerate the side effects or the perceptual distortions, hallucinations of ketamine. And so for that reason, we could give people more ketamine that need it, and they would be less averse to it. What's your take on that? And that's question one. And the sub-question is, are there any drugs in development that you're aware of that in legal in the medical research world that you're excited about?
Yeah, so I think that this sort of question about like, hey, psychedelics that have benefits without the psychedelic experience. Well, it's like, I think psychedelic means mind manifesting, so perhaps we should sort of like get away from calling those classes of agents like psychedelics, but maybe like psychoplastogens or neuroplastogens, right? And so I think that is what they're essentially trying to engineer, because I did mention neuroplasticity when I was talking about set and setting, and there are certainly mechanisms that are part of what we believe is involved in the sort of trip or the hallucinogenic journey experience. Like, for example, classic psychedelics stimulate serotonin 2A receptors, and there's some level of neuroplasticity that's associated with serotonin 2A receptor activation. But classic psychedelics also stimulate neurotrophic factor receptors directly themselves. And so at least some part of the mental health outcomes or the neuroplasticity that they can create really may not be dependent upon the hallucinogenic trip or the experience. And right, there could be certain persons that either don't tolerate those, or it's just outright frankly dangerous for them to stimulate serotonin 2A receptors because they have a condition, a psychotic condition, where the drugs that seem to work for them are ones that block serotonin receptors. And so the idea that we're going to be stimulating those and that's going to be a real boon to their mental health isn't that plausible, even really
Right.
at baseline overall. And they're in a camp that we might just consider, that's a contraindication. And so I don't know. There's a part of me that's really enjoyed the types of experience that I've had on a personal level. And so like, would I really enjoy psychedelics without any kind of like psychedelic activity to them for myself personally? Like, no, I would rather have the sort of like experience associated with them. But I also think we are, thank God, coming out of this period of prohibition where all of these questions have been things that we've been not allowed to ask, and it's been oppressed from a scientific angle. And so when I see the psychedelic community like bristling to the point where it's like, well, that's dumb science and there's no reason to investigate that question, I'm like, hold on. Like, I don't think that there's really like too many questions about this that aren't worth a trial or two or investigating or a drug development effort at this moment in time. And it is just frankly anti-scientific to hold those levels of bias against these types of questions and to not want to go down that avenue and at least see if there's something there or whether it truly dead ends. And, if it dead ends, you can be like, I told you so. Right. But don't say I told you so before we're allowed to go down that avenue when we just historically haven't been gone down that avenue. And you've been saying, it's wrong and we're not allowed to go down these avenues. I mean, there's something that just doesn't really feel right about that to me. I don't know if I'm excited about it, but I did just read a headline the other day about a clinical trial, and gosh, Zuspindidol was a psychedelic that was recently tested, a non-hallucinogenic psychedelic that was recently tested that did have positive data for the relief of depressive symptoms. And sometimes we've even noticed, right, that hey, even in some of these clinical trials with psilocybin and SSRIs, and it seems for some people, they actually do have a hallucinogenic trip or experience while they're on SSRIs. For some people, it seems like the effects are diminished. But boy, even in some of the people where the effects are diminished, some of them get antidepressant benefits a few days or a week later. So, okay, the SSRIs might be blocking some of the serotonergic effects, but they're not blocking those neurotrophic factor receptors. And so I believe that there is more to the story, I guess, when it comes to neuroplasticity. And we're probably in a place where the data and science is now that we really know that to be true. But to what extent is it true, and how feasible are the other options for different patient populations? That's the part where we're going to have to wait and see. And I'm excited to get to discover that after not being allowed to ask any questions about it.
Well, and I think circling back to something we said at the very beginning as we close up, I wonder if we're ever going to do ayahuasca.
Because you're asking, as in you and me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Because, and I'm just curious to have Ben eavesdrop on this for just a second. It sort of scares me, and maybe you've heard this, Ben. I've had some rough psilocybin experiences to the point where I tend to not appreciate it without something like MDMA accompanying it, and so I'm afraid. But is that the whole point? To deal with and sort of deal with your fear of loss of control? Is it going to be good, Ben? I just want to ask you.
I don't know. I mean, it's hard. It's hard to answer whether a person's experience is going to be quote unquote good or bad, right? And some persons are going to be good and bad, or just constructs that your minds have created rather than anything that's even true in the universe and blah blah, right? But I think one thing about ayahuasca that truly is unique, well, there's many things that are unique about ayahuasca overall. It's got monoamine oxidase inhibitors in it. It tends to have a much more somatic effect as far as causing actual vomiting or diarrhea, whereas nausea, very common with things like psilocybin mushrooms, but actual purging with fluids coming out and stuff, a whole lot more rare overall. But the psychedelic in ayahuasca and DMT has no tolerance to subjective effects with repeated dosing. Whereas with psilocybin-containing mushrooms, there's a strong tolerance to subjective effects with repeated dosing, to the point that trying a half a gram of mushrooms and then another half a gram an hour later, and then another half a gram an hour later, and you're just going to waste a lot of mushrooms that way and come up with a tolerance and say, I ate 5 grams over 8 hours and it felt like I ate 1 gram total. And it's yeah, because you spaced it over 8 hours. So what should I do? Eat 5 grams all at once? Whoa, hold on. You might not know where you are anymore because it could just be too strong. Whereas ayahuasca, totally titratable. You can take a 30 milliliter ounce all at once and it can hit you like a ton of bricks. You can take 5 milliliters, and then an hour and a half later, if that's not strong enough, take 5 milliliters, and then that was quite strong, but you want a little bit more as a nightcap, you can take 2 milliliters.
Is that the way that it's done in ceremonies?
It's not the standard way it's done. Usually it's kind of let's pick what we think is going to be about a moderate dose, which for most brews is going to be about 10 to 20 milliliters, about 1 tablespoon or about 15 mLs, and then boost as needed. The boosters are oftentimes stronger than the initial doses, because I think the initial doses, a lot of it is going to be about blocking monoamine oxidase in your gut and liver to create systemic bioavailability and psychoactivity for DMT. But those second doses, your monoamine oxidase is already blocked from the first dose. So the second doses, they tend to be much more psychoactive, or the DMT can just go straight to your brain, so to speak. And so if you've taken, say, 15 mLs off of the bat and even gotten a moderate psychedelic effect, but maybe it's been 2 hours and they're offering the booster bar is open and you want to have some more, right? I would be very careful about drinking another 15 mLs at that point. I would probably be thinking more like 5 to 7.5 mLs. Like, my rule of thumb is that if I've felt the first cup, I don't want a second cup that's more than 50% of the dose. And I've seen persons that maybe they don't have very much experience themselves, or maybe the person's pouring don't have a ton of experience themselves, and they'll sort of say, well, I took 15 mLs off the bat and it's kind of weak, so here's another 15 mLs, and then 15 minutes later they're almost like agitated and not necessarily like knowing where they are and really aren't having a good time. But for a person that is stepping into this, because I've had some pretty jarring experiences with other things, and I really don't want to go over the edge with this like right away, right? Like, it is completely reasonable to have conversations about starting low, going slow. Oftentimes ayahuasca, the ceremonies are going to be over more than one night. Why? Because you can. Whereas having psilocybin ceremonies 2 nights in a row is just usually going to dud the second night. Right? Having 2 experiences in 5 or 7 days, that's a common retreat model for things like psilocybin. But it's pretty rare to find retreat models that will just do it 2 days in a row. Why? Because of this tolerance and this lack of subjective activity with repeated dosing in shorter periods of time. But with ayahuasca and DMT, that's not a concern. And so you can do a little bit of warm up, stick your toe in. Okay, I think I had enough there. All right, did I wake up? How did I feel? Was I spooked? Did I do okay? All right, I think I want to adjust myself and go a little higher, or that was perfect and I actually don't want to go higher the next night, right? And so I think that being empowered by understanding kind of like, what is the titratability of the substance that I'm using? And with DMT, it's completely titratable to the point that they're doing experiments where DMT has intravenous infusions. Why? Because a drug that you can infuse constantly that causes a consistent psychoactive effect that has very limited tolerance to it is an ideal drug to give via intravenous infusions as far as the administration route overall.
I mean, that's going to be huge when that comes through.
Deep state, like titrate it to effect, too strong, come back down. Want to go back into the other world? You can, right? Like, all right, usually the NN-DMT experience by inhalation is so short. Gosh, I was like almost there and I can always remember it, but then it's like kind of faded and gone like a dream. Like, oh, what if you could put a person in there for 45 minutes to 2 hours, right? Like, I don't know, like, could there be psychological risks to that? Like, sure. And from the angle of knowing consciousness and mapping consciousness and doing scientific research in states of consciousness, that could be an incredible breakthrough, right?
Yeah. I've heard of some interesting studies where they're doing the continuous IV DMT and asking people separately to describe like the world that they're encountering. And like, wow, this is not, I don't think, a scientific like neuroplastic study. It's more about the
experience,
the hallucinations, and whether there's a common, for people who actually believe that our brain is filtering what is actually reality and there is another world that we don't have access to. They want to like sort of reconstruct this world based on firsthand accounts from people doing continuous DMT.
Wow. So Andrew Gallimore, he's an intravenous DMT researcher. He's got a new book out called Death by Astonishment, right? And highly recommended if this last piece of the conversation on IV DMT is interesting, because that guy has an incredible wealth of scientific knowledge and then an incredible wealth of just personal sort of observational experience, and he's the one on the front lines like doing these kinds of experiments like you're talking about, Keith. Death by Astonishment by Andrew Gallimore. Yeah,
very cool. And Ben, you're very cool. I appreciate what you're doing, and I hope people can get in touch with you, and especially if they're in the field and need I think you call it psychopharmacokinetics. It's a word that I don't use, but I learned that from you.
Psychopharmacology is like the broader discipline, and then within that you've got things like pharmacodynamics, so like how drugs work as far as their mechanisms, and then pharmacokinetics as far as like how they're processed, absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion, right? And so the dynamics and kinetics are basically two major branches of the larger discipline of pharmacology. But persons can find me at spiritpharmacist.com. I do different, like clinical work, like I was talking about, as far as like the information, benefit, like risk assessment that's truly like individualized. I'm an educator, so I've got different downloadable resources, blogs, webinars, full length types of courses. I've got member programs that kind of hybridize some of the individual consulting with access to like libraries of resources. And then I actually have a full-on psychedelic mastermind training program that really focuses on the biomedical screening aspects, and has been something I've started in the last year that I'm getting a lot of really great feedback from, particularly from healthcare providers that are, I think, really well equipped to step into a high level discussion about drug pharmacology and not feel like a fish out of water there overall. So spiritpharmacist.com is the place that people can find to get a hold of me for all of those types of services and resources.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think you're doing something special and unique, and you also play the didgeridoo. So we've established that is like putting you in this rarefied space. So Ben Malcolm, hey,
thank you so much, Ben.
Thank you so much, Keith, Courtney. It's been such a blessing talking with you both.
Thanks for listening to Tripping Over Love. Subscribe now to make sure you get the latest episode, and drop us a comment or a question. See you next time.